Henry Harrington married a ghost. At least that was what society whispered when the Duke left his frail, coughing bride at a rotting country estate just 2 days after their wedding. He gave her a title, a drafty roof, and his complete absence. He expected a black-edged letter of condolence within the year. He did not expect to return 3 years later to a home that smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, run by a woman who flatly refused to die. The ink on the parish register took an agonizingly long time to dry. Henry Harrington, Duke of Ashbourne, stared at the dark, wet script of his own name. Beside it, the signature of his new wife trembled. Beatrice Linfield. Or as of 3 minutes ago, Beatrice Harrington. The church was empty, save for the priest Beatrice's heavily indebted father and the cold November draught that rattled the stained glass. There had been no flowers. There had been no music. It was a transaction pure and simple, devoid of the sentimental trappings that usually disguise the brutal commerce of the aristocracy. Lord Linfield required £50,000 to keep his remaining estates out of the hands of creditors. Henry required a wife to fulfill a tedious clause in his late father's will before he could take up a diplomatic commission in Prussia. Henry turned to look at his bride. She was a slight thing swallowed by the heavy grey wool of her travelling gown. Her skin possessed the translucent bruised quality of old porcelain, and her chest rose and fell with a shallow, erratic rhythm. As if on cue, she pressed a linen handkerchief to her mouth and surrendered to a violent, rattling cough. Her shoulders shook. Her father looked away embarrassed, as if her illness were a social faux pas. Henry simply watched her, his expression unreadable. He did not harbour any active malice toward Beatrice. He simply did not have the emotional bandwidth to care. The continent was on the brink of war. His mind was occupied by troop movements, supply chains, and the delicate, lethal chess game of international politics. Marriage was merely another box to check. "The carriage is waiting," Henry said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that commanded the cavernous space of the empty chapel. Beatrice lowered the handkerchief. Her eyes, a striking shade of pale hazel, met his. They were red-rimmed and exhausted, but surprisingly lucid. She offered no apologies for the interruption. She simply nodded. "I am ready, Your Grace." The journey to Oakhaven took 10 grueling hours. They rode in absolute silence. Henry sat on one side of the velvet-lined carriage reviewing dispatches. Beatrice sat opposite him, shivering, despite the heavy lap robes. Oakhaven was Henry's most remote property, nestled deep in the damp, unforgiving hills of the north. It had not been properly inhabited for 2 generations. It was a place where things were sent to be forgotten. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt in the fading twilight, Beatrice peered out the rain-streaked window. The manor loomed against the darkening sky like a rotting tooth. Ivy crawled up the stone facade, digging its roots into the mortar. Half the windows were dark, and the other half reflected the meagre light of a single lantern held by an elderly servant standing on the cracked front steps. Henry stepped out first. The mud instantly swallowed the soles of his boots. He did not offer his hand to help Beatrice down. His mind was already calculating the distance back to London. She descended the steps unassisted, her boots slipping slightly on the iron grate, and stood beside him in the freezing drizzle. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your quarters," Henry said, barely looking at the house. He turned to face her. "The estate produces a meagre income, but my solicitor will forward an allowance to cover your necessities. I ride for the coast at dawn." Beatrice pulled her cloak tighter around her thin frame. "How long will you be away?" "As long as the Crown requires," Henry replied. He looked down at her. In the gloom she looked alarmingly fragile. A gust of wind could have broken her. He felt a fleeting, uncomfortable twinge in his chest, not quite pity, but a cold acknowledgement of reality. Her lungs were failing. The doctors in London had given her a year, perhaps less if the winter was harsh. And northern winters were always harsh. "The air here is supposed to be good for the constitution. I trust you will find peace here, Beatrice." It was a dismissal. It was a polite way of saying die quietly and do not cause a fuss. "I understand," she said. Her voice lacked the tremor of her hands. It was flat, resigned. Henry tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the stables where a fresh horse was already being saddled. He did not look back. He told himself it was the pragmatic choice. To linger would be to invite a messy, emotional display, and he abhorred messes. He rode through the wrought-iron gates of Oakhaven as the rain began to fall in earnest, leaving his sickly bride standing in the mud, staring up at a house that was essentially a tomb. Inside, the chill of the manor was absolute. Mrs. Gable, a gaunt woman with weary eyes, led Beatrice through cavernous hallways draped in dust sheets. The air smelled of mildew-cold ash and decay. "His Grace did not inform us of your arrival until yesterday, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable muttered, leading the way with a single flickering candle. "We only had time to prepare the master suite in the east wing. I'm afraid the fireplaces draw poorly." Beatrice followed the housekeeper. Her chest burned with every breath. The dampness of the house seemed to seep directly into her bones. When she was finally left alone in a massive drafty bedroom dominated by a heavily carved four-poster bed, she sat on the edge of the mattress. She did not cry. Crying required air, and she had none to spare. She looked around the gloom. She knew exactly what Henry Harrington thought of her. She was a broken thing, purchased for a title, discarded in a ruin. She laid her head back against the musty pillows, pulled the thin blankets up to her chin, and let the fever take her. The first 3 months at Oakhaven were a blur of delirium and agony. Winter arrived with a vengeance, burying the manor in thick, suffocating snowdrifts. The wind howled through the loose window panes, carrying the biting cold directly into the house. Beatrice nearly died in January. The fever spiked, turning her skin to fire and her mind to ash. She spent weeks suspended in a hallucinatory haze, coughing until she tasted copper sweating through the rough linen sheets. Mrs. Gable and the few remaining staff, a groundsman named Thomas and a scullery maid named Mary, tended to her with a grim, practiced detachment. They had seen people die of the wasting sickness before. They kept the weak fire burning and forced thin chicken broth down her throat, waiting for the inevitable morning when they would find her cold. But the inevitable morning never came. Sometime in late February, the fever broke. Beatrice woke up. She was devastatingly weak, her collarbones sharp enough to cut glass, but her mind was entirely clear. She looked up at the water-stained canopy of the bed. She listened to the rattling of the loose window frame. She felt the heavy, suffocating dampness of the room. A profound, white-hot clarity washed over her. She was not going to die. Not here. Not in this miserable, freezing room waiting for a husband who had already written her off as a casualty of his convenience. "Mrs. Gable!" Beatrice rasped her voice, sounding like dry leaves over stone. The housekeeper, dozing in a chair by the dying fire, jerked awake. "Your Grace, get me out of this bed, and get me out of this room." It took 2 days to orchestrate the move. Beatrice, leaning heavily on Mary's shoulder, forced herself out of the cavernous, unheatable master suite. She walked the corridors of Oakhaven, ignoring the agonizing burn in her lungs, until she found what she was looking for. It was a smaller bedroom on the ground floor facing south. It had a modest hearth, heavy oak-panelled walls that trapped the heat, and a large window that caught the pale winter sun. "This one," Beatrice declared, leaning against the doorframe, breathless but resolute. "But Your Grace, this is a housekeeper's parlour. It isn't fit for a duchess," Mrs. Gable protested. "I don't need a duchess's room," Beatrice replied, gripping the wood to steady herself. "I need a room that doesn't actively try to murder me. Move my things." That was the turning point. Beatrice stopped acting like a dying woman and started acting like a living one who happened to be sick. She reviewed the household ledgers. The allowance Henry's solicitor sent was small, but it was consistent. However, under the previous absent management, it had been squandered on useless things polished for silver, that no one used expensive candles for rooms that were never entered. Beatrice cut the waste immediately. "We board up the east and west wings. Beatrice instructed Thomas from her chair by the newly roaring fire in her small room. Drain the pipes there so they don't burst. Consolidate the living quarters to the central block. We are heating too much empty space. Use the saved funds to buy seasoned firewood. I want fires burning in the inhabited rooms day and night. The servants were shocked, but they obeyed. For the first time in decades, Oakhaven had a master who actually gave a damn about the draft under the door. When spring finally clawed its way through the frozen earth, Beatrice ventured outside. The fresh air, though crisp, lacked the stagnant, mouldy quality of the manor's dead wings. She found the old kitchen garden heavily overgrown with briars and weeds. She didn't hire a landscape architect. She didn't order ornamental roses. She ordered Thomas to clear the weeds, and she sent into the village for seeds. Thyme, rosemary, mint, lungwort, mullein. Plants that were practical, plants that had a purpose. At first, she could only sit on a wooden bench for 10 minutes a day watching Thomas work. But as the weeks passed, she began to join him. She knelt in the dirt, her expensive woolen skirts stained with mud. The physical labor was excruciating. Some days, pulling a single stubborn root would trigger a coughing fit that left her gasping on the grass for half an hour. But she refused to stop. The smell of the wet, turning earth felt like an antidote to the stifling dust of her past life. "You'll catch your death out here, Your Grace." Mrs. Gable would fret, bringing out a shawl. "I am catching my life, Mrs. Gable," Beatrice would reply, wiping a streak of dirt from her forehead. She began to brew teas from the herbs she grew. She didn't delude herself, she knew she wasn't cured. The rattling in her chest remained a constant companion. She still had bad days where the weather turned and she couldn't leave her bed. But she was no longer fading. She was adapting. Oakhaven adapted with her. The house, stripped of its pretentious, decaying grandeur, became functional. It became comfortable. Beatrice purchased heavy woolen rugs to cover the cold flagstones. She had the local blacksmith repair the kitchen ranges, so the manor always smelled of baking bread and roasting root vegetables. She spent her evenings in the small library, wrapped in a blanket, reading agricultural texts and estate management books. She stopped waiting for letters from Henry. For the first year, his solicitor sent a quarterly note confirming the deposit of funds. By the second year, the letters stopped, though the money continued to arrive at the local bank. She heard rumours from the village the Duke of Ashbourne was in Vienna, then Russia, then Spain. He was negotiating treaties, surviving assassination attempts, advising kings. To Beatrice, he was a character in a fiction novel. The reality of her world was the ripeness of the tomatoes in August, the stockpile of firewood for November, and the quiet camaraderie she shared with the servants who had become her family. She had taken an empty, rotting shell and filled it with warmth. She had forged a life out of the scraps she was given. She didn't need a husband. She had a home. 3 years. It had been 3 years of relentless noise. Henry Harrington rode through the northern countryside, his posture stiff, his eyes ringed with the deep purple exhaustion of a man who had seen too much. The continent had drained him. He had spent 36 months wading through the muck of European politics, negotiating borders over tables stained with wine, sleeping in military tents, and stepping over the bodies of men he had ordered into battle. He was celebrated as a hero in London. The Crown had showered him with accolades. He had stayed in the city just long enough to appease his monarch, and then he had fled. The grand ballrooms felt suffocating. The sycophantic whispers of the nobility grated on his nerves. He felt hollowed out, a man running on the fumes of duty and discipline. He needed silence. He needed the absolute dead quiet of Oakhaven. He had not thought of his wife in months. Communication had broken down completely during the chaos of the Russian campaign. The last report he had received from his solicitor over a year ago was that funds were still being drawn. He assumed she was either clinging to life by a miserable thread, or she was already dead and buried in the family plot, and the solicitor had simply failed to inform him. Frankly, Henry had prepared himself for a grave. It would be a neat, quiet end to a transaction he barely remembered making. He arrived at the boundaries of the estate in the late afternoon. The sky was the colour of bruised iron threatening rain. Henry braced himself for the sight of the overgrown gates and the crumbling drive. Instead, his horse stepped onto a meticulously graded gravel path. Henry pulled back on the reins, his brow furrowing. The massive wrought-iron gates, which had been rusting off their hinges 3 years ago, were upright, scraped clean of rust, and painted a stark, protective black. The massive oak trees lining the drive had been pruned back, letting light filter onto the path. He spurred his horse forward, a strange sense of disorientation gripping him. This was not the abandoned ruin he had left behind. As the manor came into view, the disorientation deepened into profound shock. The house was not fully restored. The east and west wings were clearly shuttered and boarded, but the central block was alive. The windows were clean, catching the afternoon light. The climbing ivy had been hacked away from the stonework, preventing further rot. And from the chimneys, thick white plumes of wood smoke drifted into the sky, carrying the distinct savoury scent of roasting meat and burning applewood. Henry dismounted by the front steps. There was no mud. The flagstones had been scrubbed and levelled. He tied his horse to an iron ring and pushed open the heavy oak front door. He did not knock. It was his house after all. He stepped into the foyer. The damp, sepulchral chill he remembered was gone. The air inside was genuinely warm. A thick woven runner covered the cracked floorboards. A vase of dried lavender and yarrow sat on a polished entryway table. The silence he had craved was absent. Instead, he heard the low hum of voices from the direction of the kitchens and the rhythmic thump of a chopping knife against a wooden block. Henry unbuttoned his heavy riding coat, feeling entirely like an intruder. He walked down the corridor, his boots muffled by the rugs. He passed the grand draughty drawing room, its doors firmly locked, and gravitated toward the warmth radiating from the back of the house. He found her in the estate office, a room he didn't even know existed. The door was slightly ajar. Henry stopped in the frame. Beatrice was standing at a heavy oak desk, leaning over a spread of architectural plans and household ledgers. She was not the ghost he had left in the mud. She was still slender, perhaps even painfully so, and her skin retained that striking paleness. But she was not fragile. She wore a practical dark green day dress, devoid of lace or frills, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her hair, which he vaguely remembered as a limp brown mass, was pinned up in a ruthless, efficient knot, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. She was tracing a line on a map, with an ink-stained finger muttering something to Thomas the groundsman, who stood respectfully beside her. "The drainage in the lower paddock won't hold if we get another heavy freeze," Beatrice was saying, her voice clear, lacking the wet rattle that used to interrupt her every syllable. "We need to dig the trenches deeper before November. Use the funds we saved from the barley crop." "Yes, Your Grace," Thomas said. Henry cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Thomas spun around, his eyes widening. He immediately snatched his cap from his head and bowed stiffly. "Your Grace, my lord, we did not know." Beatrice froze. Slowly she lifted her head from the desk. She looked at him. Henry looked back. The silence stretched heavy and taut as a bowstring. Henry saw the immediate flash of recognition in her hazel eyes, followed instantly by a wall of guarded calculation. She didn't gasp. She didn't swoon. She looked at him with the precise measuring gaze of someone evaluating a sudden, unexpected problem. He took in the dirt under her fingernails, the ink smudge on her jaw, the absolute authority with which she occupied the room. She looked magnificent. She looked entirely real. "You're alive," Henry said. The words slipped out blunt and stupid. It was not a greeting. It was an accusation of reality against his expectations. Beatrice stood up straight. She reached for a linen handkerchief resting on the desk, a reflex Henry noticed, but she didn't cough. She folded her hands over her ledgers. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace." Beatrice replied, her voice smooth, perfectly polite and cold as the northern winter. I realize a widow's weeds would have been much less trouble for you to deal with. Henry flinched internally. The hit was direct, and it was entirely earned. He stepped fully into the room, the scent of rosemary and old paper hitting his senses. I did not mean... He stopped. He was a diplomat who had talked down hostile generals, yet he found himself scrambling for words. The house. It is different. The house is functional, Beatrice corrected him. She turned to the groundsman. That will be all for today, Thomas. Please see to His Grace's horse. Yes, Your Grace. Thomas scrambled past Henry, desperate to escape the suffocating tension in the room. When they were alone, Henry took another step forward. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the neat stacks of receipts. He looked back at his wife. She was watching him, entirely unyielding, a ruler defending her borders from a foreign invader. I expected ruins, Henry said quietly, dropping the pretense of formal distance. He was too tired for lies. You left ruins? Beatrice answered, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. I simply refused to be buried under them. Henry stared at her, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. It wasn't the hollow ache of war or the cold dread of politics. It was something entirely new. He had returned to Oakhaven seeking an empty tomb to hide in. Instead, he had walked into a fortress, and he was standing face to face with the woman who had built it. I have returned, Beatrice. He said, the reality of the statement settling over him like a heavy cloak. She didn't smile. She didn't welcome him. She merely looked him up and down, noting the grey at his temples and the weariness in his shoulders. So, I see, she said. We will have to find you a room. The East Wing is boarded up. Dinner was a quiet utilitarian affair, served not in the cavernous state dining room, but in a small panelled breakfast parlour near the kitchens. Henry sat at the head of the modest oak table. It was the only concession to his rank that the house was willing to make. Everything else belonged to Beatrice. He watched her carefully as she served herself a portion of roasted root vegetables and a slice of thick, crusty bread. The fine porcelain plates of his ancestors had been replaced by sturdy, unchipped stoneware. The silver cutlery was gone, replaced by simple ironware that did not require hours of laborious polishing. Mrs. Gable poured the wine, a cheap, robust red from the village, rather than the imported clarets Henry was accustomed to drinking in London. The East Wing will remain closed, Beatrice stated, breaking the silence. She did not look up from her plate. We do not have the coal to heat it, nor the staff to clean it. Mrs. Gable has prepared the blue guest chamber for you on the ground floor. It shares a chimney stack with my parlour, so the fire draws well. Henry cut his bread. It was heavy, dense with oats, and entirely satisfying. I see you have reorganized my household completely. I reorganized a mausoleum into a home, Beatrice corrected him smoothly. She took a sip of her wine. If you prefer the grandeur of freezing to death in the master suite, I can have Thomas unlock it for you tomorrow, but you will have to fetch your own firewood. Henry paused, his knife resting against the stoneware. 3 years ago, she would never have spoken to him this way. 3 years ago, she had barely spoken at all, suffocating under the weight of her failing lungs and his terrifying indifference. He looked at her throat, noting the faint, rapid pulse beating beneath her pale skin. She was still sick. He could hear the shallow, careful way she drew breath, ensuring she didn't inhale too deeply and trigger a coughing fit. But she was no longer a victim. The blue chamber will be fine, Henry said. A flicker of surprise crossed Beatrice's eyes, gone as quickly as it arrived. She nodded once. The next morning, Henry woke to the sound of rhythmic thumping. He dressed in simple riding clothes, stepping out of the blue chamber to find the house already humming with purposeful activity. He walked toward the kitchens, intending to order Thomas to saddle his horse so he could inspect the boundaries of the estate. He found Thomas in the courtyard repairing a broken wagon wheel. Thomas, saddle my bay. I ride out in 20 minutes, Henry commanded. Thomas paused, the heavy wooden mallet resting against his knee. He looked at Henry. then looked nervously toward the estate office window. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. But I must ask Her Grace first. She instructed me to fix the axle before noon so we can transport the winter squash to the village market." Henry stared at the groundsman. He was the Duke of Ashbourne. He owned the ground Thomas stood on, the mallet in his hand and the horse in the stable. A sharp reprimand formed on his tongue, the instinct of a military commander whose orders had just been questioned by a subordinate. But the reprimand died in his throat. He looked at the estate office window. He saw the flicker of a lantern inside. He had abandoned this estate. Beatrice had saved it. And loyalty, Henry knew better than anyone, was not a legal right. It was earned in the trenches. "Finish the wheel, Thomas," Henry said quietly. "I will saddle the horse myself." He spent the next 3 days realizing exactly how superfluous he was. He was an apex predator wandering through a highly efficient closed ecosystem. He tried to review the household accounts, pulling the heavy ledgers from Beatrice's desk when she was in the garden. He sat in her chair, tracing the columns of numbers with a critical eye, expecting to find the chaotic math of a woman uneducated in estate management. Instead, he found a masterpiece of pragmatic survival. Beatrice had leased the neglected lower pastures to a neighbouring sheep farmer in exchange for a percentage of the wool and meat, eliminating the need to hire shepherds they couldn't afford. She had sold the ornamental lead from the ruined fountain to pay for the slate needed to patch the roof. It was ruthless, unsentimental mathematics. "If you are looking for missing funds, you won't find them." Henry looked up. Beatrice was standing in the doorway, a basket of freshly cut thyme hanging from her arm. Her boots were caked in mud. She looked entirely unapologetic. "I am not auditing you, Beatrice," Henry said, closing the ledger. "I am trying to understand how my estate functions. It functions because we don't waste time or heat," she replied, stepping into the room and setting the basket on a side table. The sharp, clean scent of the herbs filled the small office. "And we don't spend money on appearances." She walked over to the desk, her movements deliberate, leaning slightly against the heavy wood, as if to steady herself. "If you intend to stay, Your Grace, you must understand that Oakhaven cannot support the lifestyle of a duke. There are no valets. There are no footmen. If you drop a coat on the floor, it will stay there until you pick it up. I have spent the last 2 years sleeping in canvas tents and eating salted pork that tasted of gunpowder." Henry said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet timbre. "I do not require a valet." He stood up, towering over her. Despite her fierce posture, she was still so physically slight. He could see the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her eyes, the dark shadows that makeup could not hide. "I am not here to undo your work, Beatrice," Henry said carefully, treating the conversation with the same delicacy he would a hostile treaty negotiation. "I am simply here." Beatrice looked at him, her hazel eyes searching his face for the lie. She found none. She pressed her lips together, her jaw tight. "Then stay out of my way." By the 3rd week, the tension in the manor shifted from a sharp, brittle hostility to a cautious, watchful neutrality. Henry kept his word. He stayed out of her way. He chopped firewood. He repaired the hinges on the heavy oak doors that Thomas lacked the strength to lift. He rode the perimeters of the estate, noting the structural repairs Beatrice had prioritized and the ones she had been forced to abandon due to lack of funds. He watched her. He learned the rhythm of her illness. He learned that the damp mornings were the worst for her. She would remain in her parlour until the sun burned the dew off the grass, drinking copious amounts of a foul-smelling mullein tea. He learned that when she pushed herself too hard, lifting a heavy basket or arguing too long with a stubborn merchant from the village, a pale, dangerous flush would rise in her cheeks, followed by a hacking cough that sounded like tearing silk. He wanted to tell her to stop. He wanted to order her to rest. But he knew she would look at him with those flat, cold eyes and remind him he had forfeited the right to command her health 3 years ago. His opportunity to be useful arrived in the form of a heavily sealed letter from Lord Danvers, the neighbouring landowner. Henry was in the small library, cataloguing a shelf of water-damaged books, when he heard Beatrice's voice ring out from the office, sharper and louder than usual. He walked down the corridor and found her standing over her desk, her hands trembling with fury as she stared at a piece of parchment. Mrs. Gable stood nearby, wringing her apron. "He cannot do this," Beatrice said, her voice catching on a rough cough. She pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, forced the cough down, and slammed her hand against the desk. "He is choking the lower stream. The mill will run dry by August." Henry stepped into the room. "What is the problem?" Beatrice glared at him, ready to dismiss him, but the sheer frustration in her eyes won out over her pride. She shoved the parchment across the desk. "Lord Danvers. He claims the historical boundary line of his estate extends 50 yards further south than previously surveyed. He is erecting a dam to create a private fishing pond. It cuts off the water supply to our barley mill. I have written to him twice explaining the devastating impact. He just sent this response." Henry picked up the letter. It was written in a condescending, flowery script. Danvers essentially patted Beatrice on the head, praised her valiant attempts at husbandry, and told her the law was the law and a woman could hardly be expected to understand centuries-old property charters. Henry read it twice. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. It was the smile that had once made the French ambassador physically recoil at a peace summit. "You are dealing with this the wrong way," Henry said, dropping the letter onto the desk. "I am dealing with it logically," Beatrice snapped. "I sent him the land registry copies. Men like Danvers do not care about logic. They care about leverage," Henry said. He walked around the desk, pulling a fresh sheet of heavy vellum from her drawer. He picked up her quill and dipped it into the inkwell. "Danvers is a coward who inherited his wealth and purchased his political appointments. He thinks he is bullying a sickly widow. He does not know I am home." Beatrice watched him, her anger faltering into curiosity. "What are you doing?" "I am politely reminding him of his place." Henry murmured, his hand flying across the parchment in sharp, aggressive strokes. He didn't threaten Danvers with a lawsuit. He didn't mention the stream. He simply wrote a brief, exquisitely polite note informing Lord Danvers that the Duke of Ashbourne had returned to residence and that Henry was very much looking forward to discussing Danvers' recent highly irregular tax evaluations in the House of Lords. He added a postscript asking after Danvers' nephew, whose gambling debts in London Henry had conveniently purchased before leaving for the continent. Henry signed it with a flourish, pressed his heavy ducal seal into the red wax, and handed it to Thomas, who had been hovering by the door. "Deliver this to Danvers Hall. Wait for a response." 2 hours later, Thomas returned with a stammering, frantic apology from Lord Danvers, promising the dam would be dismantled before nightfall. Beatrice read Danvers' panicked response. She looked up at Henry, who was sitting in a leather wingback chair, calmly cleaning his boots with a rag. "That was blackmail," she said. "That was diplomacy," Henry corrected smoothly, not looking up from his boot. A heavy, profound silence settled over the room. For the first time since his return, the air between them did not feel weaponized. It felt like a shared trench. "Thank you," Beatrice said quietly. Henry stopped polishing. He looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "You built the mill, Beatrice. I merely protected the water." The fragile truce shattered 3 days later when the weather turned. A brutal, unseasonal storm swept down from the northern hills, bringing torrential, freezing rain. Henry was in the stables when the downpour began. He secured the horses and ran back to the manor, expecting to find Beatrice safely by the hearth. Instead, he found the front door wide open. Mary, the scullery maid, was frantically gathering soaked rugs in the foyer. "Where is she?" Henry demanded, dread pooling in his stomach. "The herb garden, Your Grace." The drainage ditch overflowed. She went to dig it out. Henry didn't wait. He sprinted out the back doors into the blinding rain. The wind whipped the cold water into his eyes. He found her kneeling in the freezing mud, wielding a heavy iron spade. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her skull, hacking desperately at the earth to divert the water away from the fragile seedlings she had spent months cultivating. She wasn't coughing. She was suffocating. She dropped the spade, her hands flying to her chest as her body violently convulsed, trying to draw air through lungs filled with fluid and cold. Beatrice! Henry reached her in 3 strides. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't care about boundaries. He scooped her up from the mud. She weighed nothing. She felt like a bundle of wet, freezing twigs in his arms. She fought him blindly for a moment, a panicked, drowning animal, before her head fell back against his shoulder, her lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. He kicked the back door open and carried her straight to her parlour. "Mrs. Gable! Get hot bricks towels now!" Henry roared, his voice echoing through the house, with the absolute authority of a man commanding a battlefield. He set her down on the rug before the roaring fire. He didn't wait for the maids. His hands were shaking, but his movements were precise. He unbuttoned her soaked woolen cloak, stripped off the freezing outer layers of her dress, and wrapped her in the heavy dry blankets from her armchair. Mrs. Gable rushed in with a warming pan and hot stones. Henry packed them around Beatrice's shivering body. He knelt beside her, pulling her upright against his chest, supporting her weight as she finally managed to drag a ragged, agonizing breath into her lungs. "Breathe," Henry whispered, his mouth pressed against her damp hair. He held her tight, grounding her trembling frame with his own heat. "Just breathe. I have you. You're all right." She coughed, a wet, terrible sound that rattled against Henry's ribcage. But as the heat from the fire and his body seeped into her, the blue tint slowly faded from her lips. She closed her eyes, exhausted, terrified, and utterly reliant on the man she had sworn she didn't need. Henry didn't let go. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Beatrice survived the chill, but it grounded her for a week. The brief, frightening relapse forced a brutal reality back into the forefront of their minds. She was not cured. She was a woman constantly outrunning a shadow, and the storm had allowed the shadow to catch her heel. During that week, Henry became her shadow. He moved his ledgers into her parlour. He handled the estate correspondence. When the coughing fits woke her in the dead of night, she would open her eyes to find him sitting in the chair by the hearth, stoking the fire, sliding a cup of warm, bitter tea onto the table beside her bed. He never hovered. He never offered pity. He simply maintained the fortress walls while she rebuilt her strength. It was deeply, fundamentally unnerving to Beatrice. She had built her survival on the absolute certainty of her isolation. Relying on Henry felt like leaning against a door that might suddenly swing open and drop her into an abyss. Yet she found herself looking for him when he left the room. She found herself tracking the heavy, steady sound of his boots in the corridor. She thought she was the only one haunted until the night the thunder returned. It was late April. Beatrice was finally strong enough to sit in her armchair by the fire reading a book on crop rotation. A sudden, violent spring storm broke over the hills. The thunder didn't roll. It cracked, a deafening, percussive blast that shook the very foundations of the stone manor. Beatrice flinched, looking up at the ceiling as dust drifted down from the rafters. The house was solid, but the noise was spectacular. She waited for Henry to come out of the blue chamber to check the windows as he usually did when the weather turned. He didn't come. Instead, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low, guttural gasp, followed by the heavy thud of furniture crashing to the floor in the adjacent room. Beatrice set her book down. She pushed herself out of the chair, ignoring the twinge of weakness in her legs, and walked to the door of the blue chamber. It was slightly ajar. "Henry," she called softly. Another crack of thunder detonated overhead. Inside the room, someone shouted a sharp, desperate military command in a language Beatrice didn't speak. She pushed the door open. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room submerged in deep shadows. The heavy oak chair by the window had been violently overturned. Henry was backed into the furthest corner of the room. He was dressed only in his linen shirt and trousers, his bare feet flat on the cold floorboards. He wasn't in Oakhaven. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely wild. He was staring at the window, his hands raised in front of him, fingers curled into rigid claws. The rain lashed against the glass, mimicking the sound of grape shot. Every time the lightning flashed, Beatrice saw the stark, naked terror on the face of the Duke of Ashbourne. Hold the line! Henry whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual resonant authority. He was shivering violently. Hold the line, damn you! They're coming through the smoke! Beatrice stood frozen. She had spent 3 years resenting his absence, imagining him attending grand balls and sipping champagne with foreign dignitaries. She had never considered the actual bloody mechanics of the diplomacy he was executing. He hadn't just been signing treaties, he had been standing in the slaughter. Another peal of thunder rattled the glass. Henry flinched, dropping to one knee, throwing his arms over his head, as if waiting for the blast of artillery. Beatrice didn't call for the servants. She knew instinctively that Henry would never forgive her if anyone else saw him like this, stripped of his armor, reduced to a trembling casualty of his own memories. She walked into the room. She didn't rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure her footsteps were audible against the floorboards. "Henry," she said. Her voice was calm, pitched low, the same tone she used to settle a spooked horse. He snapped his head toward her. For a terrifying second, she saw violence in his eyes, the instinct of a cornered soldier. He didn't recognize her. She stopped a few feet away. She didn't reach out to touch him. She knew better than to startle a man lost in a nightmare. She slowly lowered herself to sit on the cold floor in front of him, crossing her legs, putting herself below his eye level to remove any threat. "The artillery is gone," Beatrice said softly, pointing toward the window. "It's just rain against the glass. You are in Yorkshire. You are at Oak Haven." Henry stared at her, his chest heaving. The erratic rhythm of his breathing mirrored her own during a lung flare. "Look at me," Beatrice commanded, her voice firming up, anchoring him to the present. "I am Beatrice. Look at the stones. Look at the hearth. You are home." A ragged breath tore through his throat. The wildness in his eyes began to fracture, replaced by a devastating, crushing clarity. He looked at the floorboards. He looked at his shaking hands. Then he looked at his wife sitting on the freezing floor in her nightgown, her hazel eyes fixed on him with fierce, unwavering, steadying force. He covered his face with his hands. A raw, broken sound escaped him, muffled by his palms. The sheer exhaustion of holding his mind together for 3 years finally gave way. He didn't weep, but he shuddered, a deep structural collapse of a man who had carried too much weight for too long. Beatrice finally moved. She slid across the floorboards until she was kneeling beside him. She reached out and placed a hand on his back, right between his shoulder blades. He was rigid, cold, and damp with sweat. She simply kept her hand there, a physical tether to the present, a quiet reassurance that he was not falling into the dark alone. They sat on the floor for a long time. The storm raged outside, but inside the small dark room, the silence stretched between them, heavy and profound. When the thunder finally rolled away, leaving only the steady drum of rain, Henry lowered his hands. He leaned back against the wall, exhausted, stripped bare. He looked at Beatrice. "I ordered a cavalry charge outside Leipzig," Henry said, his voice a hollow rasp. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the dying embers in the grate. "The fog was too thick. I miscalculated the enemy's flank. 400 men rode into a marsh. They were slaughtered. The mud looked like blood." He closed his eyes. "I dream about the mud." Beatrice listened. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, because she knew men like Henry bore their guilt like a religion, and to dismiss it was to dismiss their honor. Instead, she stood up. She walked over to the overturned chair, righted it, and then went to the hearth. She added a log, using the iron poker to coax the dying embers back into a bright, consuming flame. The room slowly began to warm. "The mud here is just mud," Beatrice said quietly, placing the poker back on the stand. She turned to look at him. "It grows rosemary, and it grows thyme, and it ruins my skirts. It doesn't bleed, Henry." She walked over to him, extending a hand. "Get up off the floor. You'll catch a chill, and I refuse to nurse you when I have a mill to repair." Henry looked at her offered hand. It was small, pale, and remarkably strong. He reached up and grasped it. Her grip was firm as she helped pull his heavy frame to his feet. He stood before her, the ghosts in his head, pushed back by the absolute grounding reality of the woman in front of him. He had left her to die. She had learned to live. He had come back looking for a grave, and she was teaching him how to survive. "Come," Beatrice said, turning toward the door. "I'm going to make tea. You are going to drink it." Henry followed her out of the shadows. Summer baked the dampness out of Oakhaven. The deep, stifling heat was a harsh master, but it was kinder to Beatrice's lungs than the biting cold. For the first time in years, she went an entire month without tasting copper in the back of her throat. The estate transformed from a quiet refuge into a grueling theatre of labour. The barley crop was heavy, and the newly freed lower stream powered the mill from dawn until dusk. Henry did not supervise the harvest from the shade of a canopy. He stripped off his tailored waistcoats, rolled up the sleeves of his linen shirts, and worked the fields. He fell into the rhythm of the labourers. He hauled 50-pound sacks of milled grain into the wagons alongside Thomas. He blistered his hands, swinging a scythe, when the hired hands fell behind schedule. The local villagers, who had initially treated the returning duke with terrified deference, began to regard him with a stunned, silent respect. Men who bled and sweated in the dirt did not require titles to prove their worth. Beatrice managed the logistics. She sat at a wooden table set up in the courtyard, a wide-brimmed straw hat shielding her pale face from the brutal sun. She tallied the yields paid the seasonal workers from a heavy iron lockbox and orchestrated the transport to the market. She watched Henry from a distance. She observed the way the sun caught the sweat on his shoulders, the easy, powerful grace with which he handled a team of draft horses. He was a man built for war, channeling his immense suppressed energy into the earth. The terrifying shadows that had consumed him during the spring storm remained locked away, buried beneath the exhaustion of physical labour. Late one August evening, the courtyard finally fell silent. The last wagon had been secured. The workers had gone back to the village. Beatrice remained at her table, her head propped on her hand, staring blankly at a column of numbers. The heat of the day lingered in the stone pavers, radiating upward. She was dangerously fatigued. Her chest felt tight, not from fluid, but from sheer muscular exhaustion. A shadow fell over the ledger. Henry placed a tin cup of cold well water over the numbers she was trying to read. His forearms were streaked with dirt and barley chaff. He smelled of sweat dust and horses. "The math will still be there tomorrow," Henry said. Beatrice looked up at him. She didn't argue. She took the cup with both hands, relishing the shocking cold against her palms, and drank. "We outpaced last year's yield by 30%. The sheep paid for the extra labour, and the grain will pay for the slate to finally fix the west wing roof." "We don't need the west wing," Henry said. He pulled up a stool opposite her and sat heavily, resting his elbows on his knees. "The central block is secure. Save the silver for the winter coal. Let the west wing rot." Beatrice traced the rim of the tin cup. "I thought a duke required at least one grand hall to entertain his peers." Henry let out a low, humorless exhale. "My peers would take one look at my hands and assume I've gone mad." He turned his palms upward. They were calloused, scraped raw in places, and permanently stained with soil. "Let them stay in London. I have no interest in entertaining ghosts." He looked across the table at her. The twilight softened the sharp angles of her face. She looked tired, but there was a fierce, undeniable vitality humming beneath her skin. She was no longer the fragile girl shivering in a drafty chapel. She was the architect of his salvation. "You look well, Beatrice," he said quietly. It was not a compliment born of polite society. It was a factual, profoundly relieved observation. Beatrice met his gaze. The silence between them had changed over the summer. It was no longer a battleground of unsaid accusations. It was a space they occupied together, comfortable and dense. "I am surviving," she replied. "You are leading," Henry corrected. He reached across the table. He didn't ask for permission. He simply placed his large, rough hand over hers, trapping the tin cup between them. His skin was incredibly warm. "And I am following." Beatrice looked down at their joined hands.